Okay, welcome back. Should get started here. Last week we started off the class basically by talking about the Great Flood, and the details of the Great Flood are recorded in Scripture in Genesis chapters 6 through 8, and it notes in chapter 7 that the fountains of the great deep burst forth and the entire earth is covered. And this happens all on a specific day. We've even given the date, the day and the month of the year that this occurs. So we also talked about, I think a lot of Christians maybe aren't necessarily very well prepared to answer questions about this and the global flood. And I think it's an important topic because, first of all, Scripture tells us that all Scripture is profitable for instruction. And also it helps, if we can see the scientific aspects behind this, it helps us with our own faith to see just how consistent the Bible is with actual true scientific observations. So last week we left off by showing a short video from Walt Brown, who's the developer of what's called the Hydroplate theory. There's three basic theories that are typically used by creationists to describe the flood. One is called the catastrophic plate tectonics, which I think has a lot of serious scientific and biblical issues. And the other one's called vapor canopy theory, which is also is not very scientific at all. In fact, it's pretty well debunked, and there's maybe a few creationists that still hold to that, but not very many. But catastrophic plate tectonics is the reigning paradigm right now in the scientific world and the creationist world. Because plate tectonics, which is a standard version of plate tectonics, is pretty universally accepted in the geologic community as being true, and how the seafloor spreads and creates subduction under the continents. We'll get to that a little bit later on, but there's many scientific issues with plate tectonics, and therefore a lot of problems with catastrophic plate tectonics. So the hydroplate basically, like other theories, does have underlying starting assumptions. And these assumptions aren't really part of the theory, but they act as a foundation upon which the theory is going to be built. So I want to cover briefly here the hydroplate's theological and philosophical starting assumptions. And then by theological, we mean based on God's revelation to us in Scripture. In other words, what He's revealed to us in the Bible, in His written word. And then philosophical refers to a systematic study of a fundamental question concerning a topic at hand. In this case, this is going to be the Great Flood. And we would then want to use logic and reason and science to investigate that and investigate the case of, is this theory valid or not? So to accomplish this, we are going to use many well-known and verifiable scientific principles, such as the laws of gravity and the laws of physics, and the mechanics and cause and effect relationships. In doing this, I think we'll be able to explain many of the strange and unusual, mysterious features of our planet that are only explained really by a great flood. So before we go any further, I think I just want to define briefly what a theory is, both in its common everyday usage, as you and I might use it casually, or versus how it's actually used typically in the scientific world. So the word theory, when it's used kind of in everyday language, it usually means like a guess or a speculation. However, the scientific definition of theory is different, in that a theory is best defined as a well-established explanation supported by a large body of evidence. So here's a few examples of well-known scientific theories that you probably would recognize. The theory of evolution by natural selection is one. Plate tectonic theory is another one. Cell theory, atomic theory, Einstein's theories of special and general relativity, the Big Bang theory, and there's many others, numerous other ones. But what we find is there's considerable disagreement in the mainstream scientific community regarding many of these theories. So such is the case of the theory of evolution, for example. There's much debate about it. There's much evidence that runs contrary to it. The same thing holds true with plate tectonic theory, and the Big Bang theory as well. We've covered some of these in previous classes. But the problem occurs in defining opinions about these theories, and that some will often claim that a theory has been proven to be true and therefore is an established fact. while others will consider that a theory is still just a theory. As new discoveries are made, they modify or even cause us to toss out a theory, or sometimes theories are disproven all outright. So it's also the thought by its very nature that a theory can't be both a theory and a fact, a proven fact at the same time. But some will insist that some theories are proven facts. This is not science. This is something we need to be aware of. For example, Richard Dawkins, who's probably the world's most outspoken evolutionist and militant atheist, says this regarding the theory of evolution. He says, one thing all real scientists agree upon is that the fact of evolution is the fact of evolution itself. It is a fact that we are cousins of gorillas, kangaroos, starfish, and bacteria. Evolution is as much a fact as the heat of the sun. It's not a theory. For pity's sake, let's stop confusing the philosophically naive by calling it so. Evolution is a fact. This is, again, Richard Dawkins saying this. And there's certainly an underlying tone to this statement in that he says, if you don't accept evolution as a proven fact, you're not a real scientist. I mean, this is the way these people think. Ernest Mayr is another well-known outspoken evolutionist who wrote, the basic theory of evolution has been confirmed so completely that most modern biologists consider it simply a fact. However, in previous classes we found many, many things that run, scientific evidences that run totally counter to the theory of evolution. William C. Robertson writes this. He writes for the National Science Teachers Association. He makes a correct statement about theory versus fact when he writes, I've heard too many scientists complain that evolution is a fact, often in retort to the claim that it's just a theory. Evolution isn't a fact. Rather than claiming so, I think scientists would be better served to agree that evolution is a theory and then proceed to explain what a theory is, a coherent explanation that undergoes constant testing and often revision over a period of time. This is an important point, I think. A theory, as it develops, goes through, in many cases, many revisions over time as new discoveries are made. And therefore, it's never really finalized, meaning that it has not been, therefore, proven to be an actual fact yet. It's important to note, too, that facts don't change over time, as these theories do. And even though I think he's correct in believing that evolution has a body of evidence supporting it, I don't believe in that. He's incorrect in that. He at least knows the difference between what a theory is and what a fact is and what they can and can't do. So we should realize that scientific explanations are virtually never certain or final. And the overused words prove or fact is really never justified, except possibly in mathematics or maybe in a court of law. And science is less certain when dealing with ancient, unrepeatable events, such as the theory of evolution, as we've covered in previous classes. Again, there's a large body of evidence in direct opposition to evolutionary theory. And committed evolutionists like Dawkins or Mayr won't even consider any evidence to the contrary because they're so committed to their position. Certainly, we can never consider all the possibilities or have all the data, but we should be interested in at least looking at all the data, at least have an open mind, right? Maybe we'll overlook something. Maybe we'll overlook a physical consequence or improperly applied the laws of physics. But we should be open to investigating, even if it leads us to conclusions that don't fit our preconceived biases. Let's take it where the science takes us. So since we'll be evaluating the hydroplate theory and the other competing theories for the Great Flood during the course of this class, I think it's just important to briefly know how you can evaluate a theory. In other words, how can you test it to see if it holds water or not? This would apply to any theory, of course, not just the hydroplate theory, but to explain unobserved, unrepeatable events scientifically, we must first assume some conditions that existed before that event occurred. Of course, we can't jump in our DeLorean and go back to the future and observe the Great Flood actually happening. So the only way to explain unrepeatable events from history is to try to look at evidence and try to work backwards. In other words, use cause and effect relationships. In our case, the Great Flood, of course, is a one-time in history event. You can't repeat it in a lab. You can't test it in a lab to see what happens. However, we can use processes starting from some initial assumptions regarding what we're studying. And from these starting conditions, we can try to determine what should happen using known scientific laws, like the laws of physics. And there's three criteria that should be used to evaluate a proposed explanation. One's called process, another one's parsimony, and another one's called prediction. So looking at process first, if we start from these starting conditions, and then we can explain all the relevant observations better than any other proposed explanation, what would happen? Our confidence in this explanation would increase, right? In other words, we'd have a lot of confidence that this would be the correct theory. The theory would be correct. However, if the conditions in the operation of physical laws would have produced any result that's not present, then of course our confidence decreases. And we should, of course, use science and scientific methods in order to explain our observations. Of course, science is a field of study using observations and experiments in order to understand a natural phenomena. And I believe it will look at a number of observations starting from these underlying assumptions we're about to cover that are very well explained by the hydroplate theory, and also that the theory is supported and totally consistent with Scripture. So that's a very important point as well. So much so that I think, again, we can have very high confidence in this theory that we're trying to explain, that it actually is correct. But it's good to point out that even with a high degree of confidence, in most cases, we actually can't prove the particular theory to actually be true. So we'd also briefly should discuss miracles, which can be best described as phenomena that can be observed to be outside of our understanding of known scientific laws and principles. In other words, science can be used to explain what's occurring only when miracles are not happening. Therefore, science can't be used to explain miracles. So a supernatural beginning to the universe, for example, when it's created, is not natural. Can't be explained by our understanding of science. And the Bible doesn't tell us how God did it. He just tells us that he did it. And no one, of course, understands scientifically how the universe came into existence, how space, time, and matter and the laws of physics all began. But many of the secular scientific community will say that miracles are impossible and they're nonsense. However, there are numbers of phenomena that we can't explain using science. And of course, many miracles have been recorded in Scripture. Determining the exact number of miracles found in Scripture is a bit of a challenge, though. You know, for example, the creation of the universe in Genesis 1 and 2, is it one miracle or is it countless numbers of miracles? Interesting thought there. But one source I found on the web said there was 83 miracles recorded in the Old Testament and more than 80 in the New Testament, and that these miracles would include the creation of matter out of nothing and the beginning of life from non-living matter and the parting of the Red Sea, or Jesus being able to walk on water and rise from the dead, and of course there's many others. My view is that there are really probably countless miracles, so many that we could never be aware of them all. For example, God creates life in Genesis 1. First the vegetation, then the sea life, and the birds, and land animals, and then finally man. I think about that for a moment. Each of the different animal kinds, look at the diversity we have in our animal kinds. Each one of them is distinctly different. And I think thus maybe a separate miracle for each of the creatures and each of the plants that were created, and the sea life and the birds. And of course, now we have miracles within miracles about how each of those operate and each of those live. So, you know, it's one of those things that I think there's just an incredible number of miracles that we would never even be aware of. So how does God create or perform miracles? So I'll use a simple analogy of an apple tree here. If you and I were standing under an apple tree and an apple disengages from the branch, what happens? It falls to the ground, right? The apple, of course, will fall to the ground, and this happens every single time we see an apple disengage from the tree, right? We can stand there and watch it 100 times, and it'll happen 100 out of 100 times, right? Every single time. This is, of course, due to the laws of gravity, which are well established and observed. And the laws of gravity would also have been instituted by God during the formation of the universe, along with all the other physical, mathematical, and mechanical properties and laws contained within our universe. However, if an apple disengages from the branch, and at that time you or I reach out our hand to catch the apple before it reaches the ground, we have interrupted what would have naturally happened. We have intervened. We have prevented the apple from doing what it would have naturally done when it disengaged from the tree. So now you apply this analogy to God. If you can consider that a supernatural God can step into a situation, intervene and interrupt the laws and principles that he himself, of course, created, seems quite reasonable to me that he could do this. He's in control of everything, right? So he could step in and break his own laws to a certain extent. And thus, when he steps outside of his natural laws that he's created in the first place, that's again what we would call a miracle. So scientific principles logically must have come from somewhere, It's reasonable to assume or conclude that there was a supernatural hand involved in the creation of these laws, but we also should not use miracles as a crutch to support or explain phenomena that hasn't been described to us in Scripture. This is what some of these other flood models do. So we can't use the miracles as a rescue device, so to speak, for explanations of phenomena. Secondly, we want to use something called parsimony, which basically means the use of a few assumptions. So you want to use as few assumptions as reasonably possible to explain a lot of things. And when you have that, your confidence in your explanation is great. But if we need to make a lot of assumptions to explain a few observations, or if new observations cause us to modify our theory, then we don't really have very much confidence in the explanation. And the third part is a legitimately theory allows us to predict unusual things we should soon see if we look in the right places and make the right measurements. And so if we find verified predictions, that greatly increases our confidence in an explanation. So as we're talking about the hydroplate theory, Dr. Brown has published 58 predictions based on the hydroplate theory, which is unusual because most theories, they don't do this. They don't publish predictions. And we'll find as we go through class here that a great number of them have been verified. Now there's some still need to be confirmed, but there's a lot of them that we'll look into that have been confirmed as being true. And other theories like plate tectonics or evolutionary theory rarely make predictions, if ever. So this gives me high confidence again that I think we're on the right track here. So we must keep in mind that others may someday propose an explanation other than creation and the global flood that are consistent with all the evidence and demonstrably repeatable by cause and effect relationships. But until that happens, those that ignore the known evidence are being quite unscientific. Mr. Dawkins and others certainly are, I think, fit that category. And the evolutionists typically refuse to debate this subject about how the universe, life, and the earth began, and their speculations of undemonstrable phenomena also show poor science, especially when so much evidence refutes those speculations. So to try to scientifically understand unobservable, unrepeatable events, we must consider the various starting conditions, estimate their consequences based on known physical laws, and then see how well those consequences explain those starting conditions. So now we want to look at the hydroplate theory and its initial assumptions or starting conditions. So there's a few here, not very many, but there's a couple I want to just cover them briefly. The first assumption is that the Bible's account of the six-day creation in the biblical timelines from then till now is true. And hydroplate theory has all the standard assumptions of what's called young earth creationism, being that the days of creation are literal 24-hour days, solar days, about 6,000 to 7,500 or so years ago, and there's different timelines with different, numbers, but that creation doesn't go back any further than maybe 10,000 years at the absolute farthest. It's not billions of years. And we see the Bible's full of a record of history, and looking over Scripture, we can put the timelines together from the creation event to Jesus, and then from Jesus to today, and we can come up with this timeline. It's thousands of years, not billions. Other passages are also in total agreement with the young earth position. And Jesus, of course, affirms this himself in Matthew 19:4, where he states, haven't you read at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female? During the creation week, of course, he makes male and female humans, man, on day 6. Sounds like the beginning to me. That whole week would have been considered the beginning. So there's also literally dozens and dozens of scientific observations that are totally consistent with young earth creationism and oppose old earth creationism and its evolutionary theory over billions of times. And all the evolutionists will agree that if there's not billions of years, evolution is dead. There's just nothing to it. If you're really interested in looking at more of these evidences, I did cover them in earlier classes, but one can be found on Creation Ministries International's website, where they list 101 scientifically observed evidences of a young universe. They're totally compatible with this thousands of years timeline. So again, Bible's account of six-day creation is true. The second assumption is what God tells us at the end of the creation week, and that it was very good, and it applies that there was nothing in this creation that would have been harmful to humans. We would expect this since the entire creation of the universe and everything in it is really for our benefit as humans. He made this all for us. We also know that there wasn't any death in God's creation until the fall of man in Genesis 3 and the institution of the curse, which ultimately leads to physical death for us. And of course, we know the wages of sin is death. Therefore, before the fall of man occurs in Genesis 3, it also follows there wouldn't have been anything in the created universe that would be harmful or dangerous to us as humans. And this includes that there would not have been any volcanoes, lava, earthquakes, lightning storms, hailstorms, tornadoes, tsunamis, avalanches, mudslides, radioactivity, asteroids or meteors, and others. All of these have been found to be harmful to humans over the course of history and have caused many deaths and a lot of damage. So it seems inconsistent with God's statement that these would have been part of the pre-flood, or pre-fall, or pre-flood world where he declares, because everything is exceedingly good. So why would there be things that would harm humans if he describes it as exceedingly good? So the Hydroplate theory is the only flood theory that believes and provides a scientifically supported mechanism to explain comets, asteroids, and meteors, and that they were not part of God's original creation, that they were a result of the Great Flood. This is a very important point. All the other major creationist models say that comets, asteroids, and meteors were probably made on day 4 of creation week, along with all the rest of the heavenly bodies. But this doesn't seem to be consistent with God's declaration that the entire creation was deemed to be good or exceedingly good at the end of the creation week. Before the 20th century, comets, of course, were seen as warning signs of impending doom. There have been many instances where meteors have hit the earth and caused damage. People saw this damage when they hit the earth. In fact, the word disaster comes from dis, which means bad star. Disaster, bad star. That's where that word came from. Here, for example, is a photo of the Hoba meteorite. It's H-O-B-A meteorite. It's the largest known meteorite on Earth. It's located near what's called the Hoba Farm in Nambia in Africa. So this is a country on the west coast of South Africa. And because of its large mass, it's never been moved from where it fell. And here's a photo of the Hoba meteor as it looks now. And I turned it into a tourist attraction now, right? So fortunately, it fell in a remote area, not a populated area of the country. But imagine what a disaster this might have been if it fell in a populated area. Another example here of the damage that these bodies can do is a photo. It's called the Tunguska event. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. Of 1908, where a stony meteor about 150 feet wide exploded in the atmosphere about 3 to 6 miles above the Earth, and the blast knocked over about 80 million trees and killed 3 people. That doesn't seem very good to me, right? I don't think that's something to be good. A meteor also hit this car in New York in 1992, and I doubt that the owner of the car thought this was very good. Right? And this photo here shows NASA technicians. Now they're working on what's called the DART mission, which is a device designed to change the orbit of an asteroid with the goal of the mission to be able to deflect objects that might be in a collision course with the Earth. So obviously NASA thinks these things can be dangerous, right? And of course, another impactor that we're all familiar with is meteor crater. But what if this had fallen on a big city during modern times? Seems like these objects would not be called very good at the end of the creation week. Perhaps their origins come after the end of the creation week. And we're going to be able to show there's very strong evidence, scientific evidence, that these objects in our solar system are the result of a catastrophic great flood. So those that propose that objects are part of God's good creation need to come up with plausible reasons why this would be so. We'll see in hydroplate theory as an explanation for where these things came from that makes sense both scientifically and theologically. So the next assumption of hydroplate theory really is the major assumption of the theory. So what hydroplate theory does is uses biblical descriptions in combination with many real-world observations in order to come to this theory that explains all these unusual features that we find on the Earth. So it's deriving assumption here is that this assumed condition is that the Earth's surface was formed above a deep layer of water, and another layer of water was in above the crust. So there was a crust, a water crust water arrangement, and that's what this was, a global condition where the Earth's crust was an unbroken spherical supercontinent which covered and sealed this deep layer of water trapped between the mantle and the rock. And this sandwich arrangement encircled the Earth like the outer rings of an onion. And this is described in Scripture as occurring actually on day 2 of creation in Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. And we're going to look at that in some more detail here shortly. The average thickness of this subterranean water was likely at least a mile, and subterranean just means something occurring under the Earth's surface. And undoubtedly, variations likely existed in this rock's thickness and density when it was created. And this caused the heavier sections of this newly formed crust to depress and settle into the mantle below due to gravitational forces. Get my pointer here. I got a laser pointer now I can use on the screen. And these forces caused a deformation in the rock shell that sank or sagged and became in contact with the mantle below. So this shell, pointer here, on the outside, well, this shell right here was thick enough, but it had deformations in it and different variances of density would cause this to sink down and touch the mantle below. I'll show you a picture of that in just a second here as well. Dr. Brown calls these contact points pillars, and there were probably thousands of them all across the whole globe. And this is actually recorded as happening on day 3 of creation in Genesis 1, 9, and 10. And there's also several other striking biblical passages outside of Genesis that allude to this, that describe pillars. And we'll cover those as well. The settling, in turn, lifted the lighter portions of the crust, which then allows dry land to appear. And this, again, is recorded on the 3rd day of creation. And as this happened, we saw now the land forming on day 3. And the water then that was on the surface would drain into smaller seas, surface seas on the surface. So as the rock sagged downward, the fixed volume of subterranean water forced the thinner, lesser dense parts of the crust to bulge upward. And this formed the pre-flood mountains. So as an analogy, let's kind of think of a balloon filled with water. If you squeezed it, what happens? The water goes another direction, right? It bulges in other places. So about half the water in the oceans today on our planet was contained in these subterranean chambers, these interconnected chambers, about 60 miles below their surface. And this explains now how so much water could be contained and where this water came from when the fountains of the great deep burst forth as described in Genesis 7. So we'll we'll discuss this as we look further at the observations of just how this all fits together, both scripturally and scientifically. So here's a cutaway view of what hydroplate theory presumes as its major assumption. You'll see up here, you'll see these chambers, interconnected chambers with pillars that's global, that's all over. And Scripture actually describes this in several passages, which is really pretty stunning. And here's a little closer up view of these subterranean chambers with the continent above it, and then what Dr. Brown then names these plates as hydroplates because they're actually on top of the water. And this close-up now shows these pillars that support the hydroplates above the waters with the basalt mantle below. And it's important here to note the hydroplates don't float on top of the water, which is a key objection to some of those who oppose hydroplate theory. Rather, the water is trapped in these chambers and it's sealed off from reaching the surface of the Earth by factors we'll also discuss a little bit later on. And here's another illustration showing this arrangement where some of the waters from creation were on the surface draining into the low spots on the surface, forming these pre-flood seas. We'll see here now the pre-flood seas. These are the mountains that have risen up. As the pillars went down, it caused other parts of the crust to be pushed up to cause these mountains. And then, of course, the surface water drains into these pre-flood seas. There's an interesting passage, too, we'll talk about, where basically the water during creation is split basically in two. It's cut in half. So about half the water is above and half the water is below. So here we see the pillar-like structures we're talking about, where the granite sags and touches the mantle below here. There's also a porous ceiling. You'll see here. This is probably a little hard to see on the screen there. Porous ceiling and a porous floor on this chamber that are the result, and we'll explain this a little bit later on too, of conditions that are in the subterranean chambers that cause a tremendous amount of dissolved sediments to happen that will later be formed into the Earth's strata layers as these sediments are brought to the surface of the Earth during the Great Flood. So that explains how, again, we'll get into strata layers a little later on, but it explains where all that sediment came from to cause all these layers. Some of these layers are basically cover about 75% of the land surface today on Earth, and they're in some cases miles deep. Look at the Grand Canyon. It's made up of all these layers. So those layers stretch over virtually all of North America. I mean, this isn't just there, it's all over. And we'll show also too that this is a worldwide phenomenon. You'll see pictures I'll show later on of strata layers everywhere. I mean, they're all over the planet. There's a lower part of the porous floor too after the flood that's been discovered by seismic measurements. And this is called the MOHO down here, which is short for Mohorovicic discontinuity. I'm glad I didn't make you remember that, right? And a more detailed discussion of that will follow as well. So here's an associated minor assumption of hydroplate theory, is that the crust of the pre-flood Earth encircled the entire globe, forming one great continent rather than the 7 continents we see today. And on the pre-flood crust, there were deep and shallow seas, and they formed during day 3 of creation. Also, the mountains of the pre-flood Earth were generally much smaller than those of today. They would have been pushed up somewhere maybe in the 5,000 foot range. We don't really know. But with much of the water trapped under the crust, there would have been much more available land mass and many shallow seas dotting the surface. So, of course, today, 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by oceans. For pre-flood, it would have been probably reversed. Probably about 70 or 75% of the Earth would have been land mass, with maybe 25 or 30% being the oceans, or the pre-flood seas. While the crust could have supported small mountains in places, the topography would have been much less severe than we see today. Today's mountains, of course, are much higher than 5,000 feet in some cases. I mean, Mount Everest is today's tallest mountain at over 29,000 feet. It's nearly 6 times higher than the estimate of 5,000. Several other mountains like that are nearly as high, like K2, for example. It's about 26,000 feet high. And so reasons for these mountains being like this will be covered as well. But I'll give you an intriguing clue at this point. Right now, realize that fossils of sea life are found on top of virtually all the mountains over the entire Earth today, far above current sea level. How could sea life, fossils and shells, be on the top of the highest mountains? Something caused them to be pushed up. Later, when the flood begins, a small initial crack occurs in the Earth's crust. So there's a little animation of this crack as it races around the Earth. Several ways this crack could have started. We'll mention them just a little bit here. But once a tension crack forms in this crust, it would have, because of very high pressures in the chambers, the subterranean chambers, and the stress concentrations at each end of the crack, it would have quickly propagated the crack around the Earth in a great circle path. And this is all recorded as actually happening in Scripture in Genesis 7:11. And this can and should be taken literally when it states that on the same day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. And does that agree with scientific principles? Could this crack encircle the entire Earth on a certain day? Yes, it could. The estimated speed of this crack is about 3 miles per second. It would have just only taken a few hours to actually encircle the globe, going in different opposite directions. I'll show you that in just a second here as well. But calculations show that it would have gone about 46,000 miles in probably about 2 hours. I mean, it easily fits within a one-day period. And using modeling, we can predict on Earth where this crack started and where it ended. So the starting point of the crack appears to have occurred near what is now called the Arctic Circle, somewhere in the East Siberian Sea. So right up here, this appears to be where this crack started. We can't know for sure, but I'll show you in a second here why we think that. If you look at this map, you also notice what are called the mid-oceanic ridges, right there. Are you familiar? Is anybody familiar with the mid-oceanic ridges? You are, okay. This is basically a big scar, the biggest mountain chain on Earth, that runs around mostly on the bottom of the ocean, like the seam of a baseball. So, what we see is that this oceanic ridges, they're a scar on the ocean floor, and it roughly traces the path of the crack that opened in the granite shell above. What ended up happening too is hydroplate theory now proposes as this mid-oceanic ridges rise, the continents on either side will actually slide or start to move away from each other. This explains why, and this explains the mountain ranges that occur on the western edge of North America, right up here. So as we see these plates slide, they'll run into resistance and they'll start to buckle up on the leading edge of the plate. And you'll also see the Andes Mountains in South America. So you have really a mountain chain that runs from Alaska all the way down, all the way through here. Notice too, as the mid-oceanic ridge comes around this side here, that the western part of the United States actually goes over it. And that explains why the mountains up here are so much thicker than they are down here, because they didn't run into the same kind of resistance. So this, again, makes this the longest mountain chain in the world. Notice that the mid-oceanic ridge also bisects itself. Whoops. Bisects itself in the Indian Ocean. This is interesting at right angles. You'll see, can you see this right here? We see the mid-oceanic ridge here, but also coming in this direction. They actually run into each other. This directly contradicts seafloor spreading, which is what catastrophic plate tectonics, or plate tectonics, proposes, that the seafloor spreads, and this is where magma comes up from the mantle and causes the floor to spread. Well, how does it explain this? Okay, that can't be explained by seafloor spreading when two of them come together. Right? They're actually going in different directions at the same time. So this marks at the point where the end of the crack intersected the other one, which had already passed by. So now if we take a look at this and we run this animation here, you'll see how they come together right up here, which is our proposed estimated starting point of where the crack occurred. Can't know for sure, but since the two ends of the crack travel about the same speed, we can measure it backwards from this intersection point to find the approximate initiation point for where this rupture would have began. So since now we've superimposed the original crust over the top. So now we're looking at this being all crust. We can clearly see the mid-oceanic ridge bisects itself by running the animation forward in time. Let's run that forward. So now we watch this go forward in time. Watch as the crack comes together. It passes by first, and then the other crack coming this direction bisects it and runs into it. This is a very interesting observation in the Indian Ocean there. So again, this process begins. The start of the Great Flood leads to, again, formations of many unusual features, which we'll go through. But of course, the major assumption, of course, is the initial conditions of the trapped subterranean water. Question?
I was going to mention the other part is, of course, since everything is how it's mapped out now, and that you see some of that thing, The other question is, and that's the only one I can ask about, is what was there before that when this happened the way it happened? What was at that location that we did this?
Well, yeah, but I'll explain a little later as how the mid-oceanic or the oceanic ridges actually form. Okay.
That's just really interesting.
Yeah, it's really cool because it all follows from scientific principles. Basically, these ridges form when so much weight is removed above that. Remember the mantle below? So now you've removed all this weight above it. You have a tremendous amount of water coming out through the cracks, basically through the split, and it erodes the sides, and a tremendous amount of water and debris gets shot up into our atmosphere, coming down as torrential rain, as described in Scripture. But then the removal of all that weight is kind of like a spring. Like if you compress a spring and you suddenly take away what's above it, it'll pop up. Well, that's what happens here. And this popping up causes this ridges, which are very interesting, those ridges too. I know I'm getting probably a little ahead of myself here, but these ridges have tension cracks in them that go both perpendicular and axially to the ridge. So rock has very little tension strength when you can try to compress it, it doesn't compress very well, but you can pull it apart easier. So when when all this weight is removed and it suddenly pops up, it causes these tension cracks that go in both directions. Again, C4 spreading can't explain any of that. But the Bible's record of creation is consistent with this. So the next thing we want to do is talk now about the biblical passages and references to this outer shell, crust, subterranean chambers filled with water mantle arrangement that we found in Scripture, which of course is the key assumption to hydroplate theory. And all the important passages is in is Genesis 1:6 through 8. So this is really the most important passage as far as explaining this in Scripture. So several words have caused considerable controversy concerning the validity of the Genesis creation account, but as you'll see, the correct understanding of this verse is one of the most important things for us to understand in explaining the pre-flood conditions of the earth. And the reasons for this arrangement later lead to the conditions that make it possible for the earth to be completely covered by the flood as recorded in Genesis 6 through 8. So what I want to do is read this passage here. In just a second here. The Bible states God created the heavens and the earth during creation week, and then approximately 1,656 years later, and that varies a little bit depending on which timeline you use. Genesis 7:11 again says that in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day the springs of the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. And then the very next verse, verse 12, states that the rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. But we'll understand that word is not normal rain. The word that's used in Scripture here is not your normal everyday rain. It's called geshem. It's a Hebrew word which basically means a torrential downpour or deluge. It's not regular rain. It's beyond anything you probably would have ever experienced. Also, most people focus on, of course, the 40 days and 40 nights and thus assume that the flood lasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And this is a common misconception, too, in that the flood lasted much longer than that. It actually lasted 371 days. And I'll go through a timeline of that in the next couple classes as well. But it's also interesting to note, too, that the floodwaters continue to rise after the end of 40 days. So how is that possible? So the rain ends, but the floodwaters continue to rise. There's a really great explanation of that as well. We would have to have some special circumstances in order for this to occur. And the rain, of course, alone could not cover the entire surface of the earth. Even the pre-flood earth that did not have as high mountains as present earth does, there must have been another source of this water. And of course, reading verse 11 gives us this answer, is that it's the fountains of the great deep. And we'll have to leave off there and pick up next week.